Hello and welcome to this Oxbridge tutorial where today we're going to be going over the interview format and in particular giving you some tips and tricks about how to ace your interviews. My name's George and let's begin. So as I said, this is all about giving you a bit of an interview breakdown. We're going to be sharing with you some tips and tricks, and in the future sessions we're going to be digging into individual topics like cardiovascular function and oxygen transport in order to load you up with all the key principles that you might come across in an Oxbridge medical interview. So first things first, let's consider what Oxbridge interviews are all about. They're all about challenging you, pushing you to your limits and getting you to question concepts which you may not have done before. It starts with your basic understanding that you'll know from A-level, and the interviewers will push you until you're in unknown territory. At that point, it's all about how you analyse and logically reason through problems. So let's dispel myth number one. Oxbridge interviews are not therefore out to get you. The interviewers really just want to see you pushed outside your comfort zone in order to get to really know how you are as an academic and as a free thinker. So even though they may seem scary, there's nothing really to worry about. So what do Oxbridge interviews typically involve? Well, first of all, they start with a couple of easy questions at the start. These tend to be sort of introductory questions about your journey there, for example, how you're feeling, what you've got up to in Cambridge or Oxford during the day, or what you've got planned for the rest of the day. They may also start to stray into more sort of personal statement-based questions, or questions about your motivations for medicine in general. After that, it will then transition into a series of harder questions, which will tend to all orientate around the same topic. And this can be quite exciting. I know for me, when I applied to Cambridge, the interviews were actually a really interesting discussion because they take a concept and push you and continue to develop that concept until you're talking about something that you've never come across before, but you've built it up from first principles. So those series of harder questions, although they orientate around the same topic, essentially it will get you to push towards a topic you may not have come across before. So what are the purposes of these harder questions? Well, first, they're asked to see how well you can apply your basics in an unfamiliar scenario. Second, they're looking for logical reasoning, evidence of thinking outside the box and problem solving, as well as a genuine enthusiasm about science and research. And finally, they're often framed as a discussion. It will feel like a conversation with an academic, and that's what's so special about Oxbridge interviews. They don't feel like you're on the spot. However, you're discussing really intricate concepts, and that can be quite fascinating. Now, when it comes to the end of the interview, you may want to breathe a sigh of relief and get out there as quickly as possible, or you may have come with a question prepared. Now, my advice is that it doesn't really matter whether you've got a question prepared or not, but if you do have a question prepared, make sure it's not something that you can easily find out online. For example, there's no point in asking, what exactly does the course involve? Because that just highlights the fact that you don't really know and you haven't really done your research. Instead, a good get-out-of-jail-free question, if you're looking for something to ask, is to ask about the interviewer's academic expertise. What did they do their training in? What's their PhD in? What's their postdoc in? And what's their professorship in? What essentially is their area of expertise and knowledge. And that can help you to get to know your interviewer on a more personal level as well. And bearing in mind that the interviewer will tend to be your supervisor or your tutor going forward in the years to come if you were to get in. So therefore, this sets up a good base if you want to ask that kind of question. So what exactly will you be asked in the main chunk of your interview? Well, it varies between colleges. As you'll know, Oxbridge consists of several different colleges, and each college will like to run its interviews in slightly different ways. As such, there's not any fixed formula for how the interviews go through, unlike in other universities. That being said, there are some basic pointers that you can expect. For example, you might expect some questions relating to your personal statement or your professional goals, and that tends to be consistent throughout universities, and this isn't something specific to Oxbridge. So what therefore makes an Oxbridge interview? Well, between Oxford and Cambridge, they adopt a similar interview style. As I said, it tends to be you discussing it maybe with a panel of interviewers. They tend to try and push you outside your box and get you to think in different ways. The Oxbridge medical interview will also consist of 1 or 2 interviews, and in some cases 3 interviews. In my case, I applied to St John's in Cambridge, and I had 3 interviews at the time of application, which was now 6 years ago. Now, how those interviews are broken down depends on the college, But essentially, you can expect a more general interview, a more scientific interview, and maybe one that's assessing your ability to read and appraise a scientific paper, for example. The interview will also try to challenge your abilities, and that's the same between Oxford and Cambridge. There isn't too much difference there. They want to push you, as I said, to the edge of your capabilities. And like I said before, if 2 interviews are offered, or even 3 interviews are offered, they tend to focus on different kind of niches. One will focus mainly more on your motivations for medicine, as well as your sort of general thinking skills. Another may focus on the more scientific aspects. And this tone will be set by your interviewer. You won't be told going in what kind of station it is, but you'll quickly come to terms with it based on the style of the question being asked. So how then does the logistics of the interview work, the ins and outs of what will happen on the day? Well, interviews pre-COVID tended to be in person. And as a result of that, in Oxford, you may have stayed in one of the colleges. Now it's moved to an online format. That's less likely to be the case. Typically, interviews will span over a day. However, it's actually a very short period of time. I know for my Cambridge interview, it lasted about an hour in total. So even though you may block out the entire day, only expect to be asked questions for about an hour in complete total. And finally, interview choices depending on Oxford versus Cambridge. At Oxford, everyone interviews at 2 colleges, one they applied for and one that they are randomly assigned for. However, at Cambridge, you interview only at the college to which you applied. And that's an important difference between the logistics of the interview for Oxford versus Cambridge. So, what then are your chances? Well, Oxford tends to be more selective in terms of who they invite for their interviews. As a result of that, a smaller proportion of the applicant pool will be interviewed. And therefore, if you've got an interview, you've already done a large amount of the work in order to get into Oxford. Therefore, it's less competitive from the interview process onwards. In Cambridge, however, they tend to be a bit more liberal with the interview offers, so they tend to interview a larger proportion of their applicant pool. As a result, getting an interview doesn't necessarily give you much indication of whether you're going to get a place or not. That being said, clearly in each case you still have to be good enough, so I wouldn't worry too much about the chances, and I wouldn't worry too much about trying to game that kind of system. Essentially, if you've got an interview, that's a really good step, and you should take that as a really positive sign. On top of that, try to express yourself and be confident in the interview regardless of your chances. Don't think about the game aspect of it, just think about the interviewer sat in front of you. So who then is going to be your interviewer? Well, this again varies between colleges, and sometimes it can involve pastoral support staff as well as tutors, or specifically the supervisors who will be covering your particular course. Now, it's worth looking at beforehand some of your interviewers if you can, or if you know their names. In particular, I would Google the Director of Studies, because they're likely to be involved in your day-to-day teaching whilst at the college, and as a result are most likely going to be the ones who are going to interview you. Now, that being said, it's worth bearing in mind that most of your interviewers you will come across in your day-to-day college life, and as a result, try to form up a friendly, sort of banterous relationship with them. They are, at the end of the day, people who enjoy everything that you enjoy, as well as their academic field, so don't be too intimidated by who your interviewer is. So onto an Oxbridge tip, which goes without saying, but is one of the most fundamental tips that I can give you. Don't get stressed. Now, I know that's easier said than done, but really bear in mind that the interviewers want you to do well. They will throw you little hints along the way if you're going down the wrong track. They'll try and correct you. They'll try and sort of motivate you when you're going along the right track. All of those things can help give you confidence on the day and avoid you getting stressed. Now, that being said, it's worth knowing that you should be receptive to those signs. If you're too panicked or stressed or focused on the problem in front of you, then you're going to miss all of those subtle emotional cues that will teach you the way to go. So bear in mind that your interviewer is trying to help you, they're trying to support you, because at the end of the day, they're trying to work out whether they would like to teach you or not. And if you're too bogged down in the question, you're not listening to what they're saying, then they're not going to want to teach you for the next 5 or 6 years. So bear that in mind and try not to be stressed as much as you can. Many of the interviewers were in your seat before. They probably were undergrads at the college, or at least postgraduates at the college, and therefore they'll know what it feels like. So relax and enjoy the interview experience. So coming back to what we mentioned on before, should you look up the interviewer on the internet? Well, you should do, so long as it's not getting in the way and it's not causing you a massive amount of stress or time spent researching. Essentially, it's good to look up the interviewer on the college website in order to understand who the preclinical and who the clinical academic staff are. From that, you can see what their research interests are, and that tends to be a framework for the interviewer. Now, if, for example, they're involved in smell receptors, you might expect a bit of questioning about receptors and how they work, for example. So even though it's not worth looking at the real nitty-gritty of that interviewer's specialist topic, it is worth just having a brief and basic understanding of the field in which they work and making sure you're up to date with that specific field from an A-level point of view. Now, a good example of what I've just said is if, for example, Dr. X is a haematologist. Now, in that case, you might expect some questions about oxygen transport and haemoglobin, something related to their specialist field, even though it might not be their particular sort of genetic mutation that they work on. The basic principles may be along the lines of what they're interested in. So even though it's just an indication, it can give you a useful hint and at least give you a bit more confidence going into the interview. So I would definitely recommend doing at least a quick Google on your interviewer and not really going into a more extensive search. Keep it basic, keep it simple, and just look through what you can find online. Now, on to one of the most commonly asked questions. What should you wear for your interview? Now, it's important to say that Cambridge and Oxford don't actually care what you wear, so long as you're comfortable and that you're focused on the questions that they're asking. As a result, they'd rather you be there in loungewear, but be completely engaged with the questions, rather than sat there in a sort of stuffy suit. That being said, however, you should err on the side of being smartly dressed. Now, I say this because even though it shouldn't affect how they view you, you never know what kind of subconscious biases people bring into the interviews. And particularly interviewers, they like to see someone who's smartly dressed, who knows that they're caring about the position that they're interviewing for. So that being said, I would recommend at least smart casual, if not a full suit if you have one. So baseline point, it doesn't really matter what you wear, however, I would dress on the smarter side. So with that in mind, let's go through a quick quiz. Can you wear this for your interview? A clothing with a white or bright print? Well, I would advise against wearing something like that. Avoid wearing clothes with white or bright prints in order to avoid messing with the contrast, especially with online interviews, because that can mess up the contrast and therefore make the visual picture less good and be quite distracting for the interviewer as well. So I would stick with more dark colours if you're going to interview online. Second question, can you wear any religious headwear like hijabs or turbans? Well, surely the answer is yes, and that's true. The interviewers will want you to feel as comfortable as possible and they don't discriminate based on religious items of clothing. So absolutely wear what you like to the interviewer with this regard. So how then do you prepare for your interview? Well, unlike other medical schools, there's not a massive amount of content that you need to memorize beforehand. In fact, that's kind of by design. Oxbridge interviewers want to push you outside your box, outside your comfort zone, and see how you think in those unfamiliar situations. As such, there won't be much to memorize. That being said, it is useful to brush up on your basic A-level biology topics. On top of that, you may want to spend time reading science-related literature that you're interested in, for example from the New Scientist. Now, I wouldn't go completely to town on this and try and read into the depths of a particular topic, but it's worth spending time reading around your topic more broadly to get a sense of what's out there in the scientific community. That'll set you up well in order to speculate different ideas about how to go about solving a problem. So, what then should you read? Well, because you can't predict exactly what comes up, you can really read anything you like, particularly topics that you're interested in, because those topics will be the ones that you finish, that you're most curious about, and that you therefore memorize and remember in the interview. So pick topics that you're actually genuinely interested in, because you'll comprehend them a lot better. Now, major topics that you can consider reading are things like the latest advancements in medicine, for example, robotic surgery or genotyping, for example. You can look into health technology. You can look into public health initiatives. You can look into medico-legal cases, and that may be one that you've already looked at for your other university interviews, as well as the latest news in the field, and that's where New Scientists can come in. Now, every tutor has their own list of recommendations, and the Oxford Medical School admissions website also has a reading list that you can consider. Make sure that you don't forget about your ethics and general knowledge about medicine, and you can also check out podcasts and TV programs in order to supplement all that reading so that you don't go blind and cross-eyed just reading books all the time. So hopefully all of that helps. There's not a specific prescriptive list that you should read, but you should just make sure that you know basic concepts very well and have a few little sparkly bits that you can throw into a conversation to show that you've read a bit more around your topic. Now, what shouldn't you read? Well, you shouldn't be focusing on reading very intensive scientific papers. They won't tend to help you, and the primary literature can get very bogged down in methods-based stuff and sort of the intricacies of the field and focus on a very narrow part. What you want to be reading is things looking at the bigger picture, concept-based things, because the intricacies are something that you'll come across only later in the course. You want to get to grips with the concepts, the big picture. Now, that being said, if you're really keen to read some scientific literature, I would recommend the big and well-known journals, for example, Nature or Cell. Those journals will tend to be the most accessible and also publish the highest quality research. If you also want to read some scientific tests, you can refer to your university's reading list in order to get ahead on the stuff that you'll be reading in medical school. So, this tip comes back to what I said before. You need to be really confident in applying your basic concepts, and you need to be practicing those concepts often. Read your A-level sciences, especially human biology, and be confident applying those basic concepts, for example, things like diffusion and osmosis. Even though they may seem very simple, being able to rattle off the things that affect diffusion can give you a very useful in a particular question. Far more so than knowing all the intricacies about exactly the structure of a particular molecule. Knowing the basics will help you a lot more. And most importantly, of course, practice often. Mock interviews with your tutor or your friends and family will help you build confidence and apply the learned skills to an Oxbridge style of question. Now, onto our key tips to wrap up this video. The first one, and the biggest one that you'll be told, is to think out loud. It works wonders in interviews. They want to see how you're thinking, and the only way they can do that is if you vocalize how you're thinking. On top of that, if you vocalize how you're thinking, they can easily spot errors in your thought process and try and correct you very subtly, and that becomes a very much more engaging conversation because you can go backwards and forwards developing a concept rather than just sort of delivering an answer at the end and then no one really knowing how you got there. So think out loud, because essentially that will allow the interviewer to teach you, and that's what they're there for, to find out whether they want to teach you. The second tip, don't panic. Now, this comes back to the same sort of tip as don't be stressed earlier on. It's difficult to modulate, but what you can do is practice, so that by the time you come to your interview, it should be quite comfortable and you should get used to sort of thinking outside the box. On top of that, useful interview sort of techniques and sort of tips that you can try on your own, even if you don't have an interview partner, is to ask yourself sort of random questions. For example, how would I calculate how many leaves on that tree outside? That can get you used to the feeling of being a bit uncomfortable and trying to tackle a concept from the ground up, if you like. So try not to panic, try to reason through something, and therefore deliver an answer that's a bit more thought through. The third tip, treat the interview as you might treat a tutorial or a lesson in school. The interview is meant to be a conversation, and essentially the thing to remember is that tutors are looking for people that they think would benefit from the Oxford or Cambridge tutorial or supervision system. Now, part of that is not being afraid to ask questions and clarify things you don't know. So if you get asked a question, you're a bit confused about what to do with it, simply ask the interviewer. Try to be specific with the concept that you're sort of getting used to or that you're not really understanding, because if you just simply say you don't understand, then it will stall the interview. So try to think about it, distill it down into concepts, find the bit that you don't understand, and then simply ask. And by doing that, you sort of express an interest in the topic, and you also show that you're someone who can be taught in that tutorial or supervision system. And finally, be confident. Confidence goes a long way in interviews, and a candidate who comes across likable, engaged, and confident without necessarily being too arrogant or sure of yourself is one who will leave a good impression. So get used to talking to people in a formal and a polite way. Introduce yourself properly, maybe shake their hand if you so choose. Try to relax and enjoy having that conversation. Essentially, they're looking for someone who's having a good time in the interview as well. So that's the tutorial complete. I hope that was useful, and I'll see you again next time.